watch, yeah.
There's
Okay. Texas, black female, and I love her.
All right. We will start again.
It's working over there.
We've confirmed that it's working. So we are streaming, camera set so that we have our firm guests as well on camera. So we'll begin again. I'll call to order the Keystone Heights Airport Authority workshop for March 14th, 2024. Thank you all for being here. I have just a few introductory comments, and then we're going to move into our agenda. The overall focus of our workshop is to achieve the most favorable.
I'm sorry, if I can, sorry, it's still not working.
You want to check that, Craig? Find out. They were streaming.
Okay.
Do we have anybody that can take minutes? You want me to take minutes?
It needs to be streamed. I have people of all due respect that are watching that are.
What? Nobody minds if it streams. Legally, it has to have minutes taken.
I'm sorry.
And we're all here. Nobody's trying to not make it stream.
So
We're just trying to get this done in an expeditious manner, which
I thought you were just take minutes without. I thought you were.
well, if we can't get it to work, I would rather keep moving. That's just me. I don't have no say in this. I'm just the city's liaison trying to.
And technically, that's all we're required to do is have minutes of our workshop. I know it's convenient to have the video as well. They thought they had it streaming, so.
I was in.
We'll give them just a couple of more minutes then.
That's what we usually try to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Neat biplane came out today. Beautiful red and black.
Came out here.
Yeah, landed, ate hot dogs.
On notifications too, I guess that it's not streaming.
Back off.
Hope to get to that place in life where I have more knowledge.
It's not up on the screen, is that what it is?
Not up on this screen, yeah.
Well, the people at home aren't able to.
Well, they must have an old link maybe.
Okay.
So they would want to go back to our YouTube page and to the live section.
Got it. Yeah. Sounds like you're on, it's just not up on the screen.
Gotcha,
Okay.
okay.
So it is working. Can y'all see it on your devices, or are you looking?
Well, you just see a blue screen.
It's coming in right, I'm getting a text right now. Yeah, I appreciate your patience. I really, really do.
I think it's live.
Yeah, it looks like it's on. It looks like it is. Yeah.
So we have two that say it's live.
I can see my.
You got yours?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds great. If you can see
Okay.
it's good. I'm getting it.
All right.
Yes, it's on. Thank you so much.
All right. Bear with me as I'll repeat myself again. All right, we'll call to order the Keystone Heights Airport Authority workshop for March 14th, 2024. Our start time is 2:15, a little late, but we've had some technical issues that have been resolved. So special thanks to those ladies that take care of that for us. Again, as I'd stated earlier, the focus of our workshop here today, we want to get the most favorable position possible for the Keystone Heights Airport and the firm. As I said in our last monthly meeting, that the Keystone Heights Airport Authority doesn't want to lose any tenants, and we certainly want the firm to remain a tenant. Our goal today is to agree to a resolution addressing fair market value rent for a non-aeronautical lease. That information will be submitted to the FAA for their review and hopefully approval. The potential non-compliance issues of impacts to federal airport safety standards and the non-aeronautical use stated in the FAA's letter dated February 23rd, 2024 will be addressed in a separate workshop or workshops. So a few workshop guidelines I'd like for us to adhere to. Public comments will be limited to 5 minutes. As a reminder, it's a workshop for the Airport Authority board members to discuss the posted items on our agenda. When necessary, public comment may be solicited from a representative from the firm. Topics not on the agenda will not be addressed in this workshop. And we're going to encourage everyone, board members, as well as the public, to conduct themselves with decorum and respect one another as we're speaking, and speak when recognized by the chair. So at this time, if we have a public comment from a firm representative, please come, Robert, and share that with us.
Thank you, Chairman. Distinguished members of the board, ladies and gentlemen here today, and valued members who are watching live stream at home, either today or in the future, good afternoon. I want to start out by saying Jim Taylor, the attorney for the board, and I had a wonderful conversation yesterday. Jim, I'd like to thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Both of us agreed that we'd like to have a positive, productive, open, and honest discussion today. And I want to reiterate the firm's position that we're going to be open, transparent, candid, and speak on the level, and we're asking everybody else to show the same respect. During that call, we discussed the agenda, and I respectfully let Mr. Taylor know that the firm has no choice but to object to the agenda in its current form. The agenda was based on a February 23rd, 2023 letter, 21 days ago today, that was received by Mr. Kuhn, the airport manager from the FAA. That letter addressed three topics. The first of potential noncompliance. The first was the location of the track itself. The second was the non-aeronautical use of the property. And the third was the FAA's requirement for fair market value. I informed Mr. Taylor that addressing the first two without, or addressing the third issue identified by the FAA without addressing the first two is kind of putting the cart before the horse. If the FAA comes back and says we are not permitted to engage in non-aeronautical use, i.e. have cars going on a track, we have no business. And we are forced to cease our operations training our U.S. military. If they come back and say we are no longer able to use a certain section of the track, then that means it might cost millions of dollars to address that issue, or again, maybe effectively cease our ability to train the U.S. military. So talking about the FAA's requirement for fair market value, before we talk about whether there's even a lease or whether we can continue to conduct business, again, I still take a firm stance. Those issues need to be identified first. I was just informed yesterday of being a second workshop. But I do want to make clear the firm's position on fair market value. We have performed as required under the lease. We have provided notice. The lease has already been renewed. No further actions are required from the firm. Related to fair market value specifically, we have a legal, valid lease, a lease that this board approved first in 1999 and again in 2012. And also when this lease was assumed by the firm. Mr. Kirkland, I believe you were on the board at that time. As conveyed in my formal notice to Keystone Heights Airport dated February 8th, 2024, as president of the firm, I conveyed in relevant part the following, which I'll express again verbatim. This notice serves as the firm's unequivocal intent to exercise its right to the firm, to the first of the firm's two options to renew for the additional period beginning June 1st, 2024 and ending June 1st, 2039, strictly in accordance with the original terms and conditions. I'm reading fast based upon the time, including those related to the rental increase terms as specified in the lease agreement. It establishes a set rent schedule and annual escalation rate of 1.5%. Confirmation was independently obtained prior to our assumption of the lease, independently, that the lease amount would only increase 1.5% for the duration of the time we rented the property, including during the two optional renewal terms. This predictable rent escalation schedule was inducement for the firm that the firm relied upon to assume the lease and make significant investments to the business and the property, a sum of over $4 million to date. 2 days ago, Ms. Heinz, a very respectful lady that we are very thankful to have as a vice president of the firm, is here today. Ms. Heinz, thank you for joining us and being here with us today. She sent a public notice requirement to the members of the board and others in the community, asking that in addition to the 2 items that I've requested be added to the agenda, that an additional, a 4th item be added. I will very briefly touch on that. During the February 6, 2024 board meeting, Chairman David Kirkland conveyed, and I quote, "The lease is a renewal with no increase in the lease amount and a limited 1.5% year increase," end quote. This is consistent with the lease terms. And the lease, I state verbatim, and I quote, "The tenant shall have the option to renew this lease for 2 additional periods, with the first option period for an additional 15 years, and the second option period being an additional 10 years. In addition, the rent states further along, and I quote, "The rent will increase 1.5% per year, each and every year," end quote. During the November 8, 2023 board meeting, the board expressed its desire to carve out areas of the track. These areas are vital to our rally-style driver training, specifically scoped as the foundation of all our military training contracts. It was further stated that the board had interest from the Guard as well as Clay County Development. None of this was expressed to the firm to this date. We request that the board identify what has changed, where the board acknowledges the terms of the lease on one hand, and on the other contemporaneously intends to carve out portions of the lease. Please clarify this is Clay County Economic Development or Clay County Development Authority. Also, please clarify specifically what areas of the firm leased property the board is referring to and wants to carve out. We understand the board has been diligently preparing for this workshop since before November 2023. The firm only learned of the board's intent to break up the lease in the days after the March 18th, 2024 meeting, which was a week ago today, and only as a result of our own independent research. I look forward to open, transparent, and honest engagement to work to find common ground on all these matters and move forward in a positive, productive manner and in the best interest of the parties at this workshop and the surrounding area. There's been, in effect, a gag order on anyone at the firm. If the firm asks a question, people at this board have been told and instructed, do not engage. Do not engage with the people at the firm. Well, and also told if they have a question, inform them, they will be told at the right time. Well, when is that right time? We know right now today when that right time is. And in the words of Taylor Swift, it's never, ever, ever, ever. Again, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bond.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Taylor, I believe you have some introduction and background as well.
Briefly. I think the board's consideration of the fair market value rent issue, which was the subject of today's workshop, is framed by 3 documents. One is the 1999 lease with the European Rally, which 2014 firm assumed, and relevant to the workshop, that lease in several places makes the lease expressly subject to FAA review and compliance with FAA rules and regulations, and expressly provides that upon a review by the FAA, if the FAA says that something has to be modified, then the landlord, the airport, and the tenant firm will comply with FAA's concern. The second document that frames the fair market value rent issue is the appraisal that the airport had prepared by Steve Albright, who, as I mentioned at the public meeting last week, he has experience with appraising fair market value rent for non-aeronautical properties at airports. And so his fair market value rent appraisal appraises the fair market value rent as of the date of his appraisal, which was, I think, December 6th of last year, 2023, as being in a range from approximately $88,000 a year to $100,000 a year. And that, of course, is substantially in excess of firm's annualized rent for 2023, which it was in the range of, well, under $25,000. So that's the second document that, to me, frames the issues for the board's consideration on fair market value rent. And I'd like to point out in this regard that when the 1990 lease was put in place, the board at that time, no member of today's board was a board member at that time, and I was not airport counsel at that time. But when that 1990 lease was put into place, the airport board did follow the same rules that this board followed in soliciting Mr. Albright's appraisal. That is, there was an appraisal done, and the appraised value falls within the range of what the rent was established at the lease commencement in 1999. So it was, I think, a reasonable exercise of the board's stewardship role with respect to the airport, that with the 25-year expiration of the initial term of firm's lease coming up in June of 2024, the airport would solicit a new appraisal to appraise fair market value now to see how that compares with what the 1999 lease's 1.5% annual increase has resulted in. And so what we have there is Mr. Albright's appraisal that gives us the answer. And then the third document that frames the issue is the FAA's notice of potential noncompliance that was dated February 23, which everybody's referred to already and in last week's meeting. And specific to the fair market value rent issue, that notice of potential noncompliance expresses a concern that in light of Mr. Albright's appraisal, it appears on the face of things, at least, that the current rent being paid by firm is not fair market value rent. And so, to me, those are the three documents and the relevant parts of them that frame the issue for the board to consider its options as to how the board wishes to respond to the FAA, because in that notice letter, the FAA made expressly clear that they expect a response.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I would like to continue with the agenda as is for discussion purposes.
Hey, if I can we have some comment as to whether we can adjust the agenda based on what was stated here and based upon the requests that have been made? We had no say, the firm had no say in what was on that agenda at all whatsoever. In fact, I'm curious as to how the FAA was informed about potential issues. So I'm curious as to when the FAA was formed. We've been on the property for 25 years, and it's never been an issue. So respectfully, if we could have some discussion, I would very much respectfully appreciate that.
I appreciate that, and that can be addressed at a different meeting, because our workshop is designed with this agenda in mind to address an issue that will have to be addressed. I mean, there's the three issues, one of them being the fair market value rent. So I think it's still prudent that we go through the items that are listed on the agenda and have that discussion with respect to that topic.
But if the FAA says we're a non-aeronautical lease and that part of our track is in their safety zone, we have to have resolution of that, because the FMV is moot at that point. If the FAA says you have a non-aeronautical lease, we're not going to approve it. And that's why I sent out, the letter outlining the order of resolution to see if we can even exist to be a business. I mean, you guys might spend 2 hours talking about what our market rent is, and the FAA might say, we're not gonna approve your non-aeronautical lease, and you can't use that portion of the track, and you might not be able to afford to move it. And now we've spent 2 hours talking about something that's moot. So from a business as a going concern, those have to be issues that we get some education on, what the airport's intentions and next steps are to resolve those first two things to see if we even have a viable business.
I hear what you're saying. Mr. Van Zandt?
So just to cage this in what has to happen as a publicly advertised meeting is you can take action on the agenda items that you've advertised. And I assume this agenda was advertised to the public for the meeting?
Correct.
So that's what you can do today. At the chairman's discretion, he could discuss anything he wants. They can't resolve anything today as a board, voting members taking action, which there's 5 of them. Me and everybody along the wall, there's not one, other than what's on here. So
That was the
We would
reason.
have liked to have known that was when we sent our letter out, getting a response, and we would have requested a reschedule to make sure that the order of operations, whether or not we have a business based on the FAA's rulings for being a non-aeronautical lease and being out of compliance in their safety zone, are resolved first prior to discussing FMV.
Well, remember, the FAA said it's potential non-compliance.
They're just not resolved though.
I agree, and we have the same concerns because we want to make sure that we're in compliance with the FAA, obviously, for a lot of reasons. So, again, our fair market value.
That might not exist.
Well,
That's my just very
because-
basic question.
And I have an answer for you, because that's one of the things that we have to submit to the FAA for their review and approval. So it's got to be addressed eventually. Now, one of the things that Craig and I have been trying to resolve, and Craig's been doing a lot of research and trying to talk with the FAA about that encroachment that the track is into the RPZ, whether or not, if some other safety measures were put in place, and then we submit that to the FAA for their review, and again, hopeful approval, that it's not a true non-compliance issue. So that's our strategy, was to at least work on this first, then address those other 2 issues. Because if they say it's okay with the one about the encroachment, the other one goes away.
I appreciate it.
As far as the safety concerns that the FAA has expressed. So that's the strategy for putting the workshop together, that we look at this FMW rent or FMV rent first.
But we've never been communicated with the steps of what this involves, what you plan on doing, what your intentions are. And we were under the impression that's what the purpose of this workshop was, based on statements made in the last board meeting. So we really want to understand the process, what you all intend to do, the fact that we're a non-aeronautical lease. And that's new information that you're sharing about what your intentions are. But that's never been shared directly with us. And like I said before, we've never gotten any phone calls or letters saying, hey, there's an issue, here's how the process works, here's what we plan on doing. And we need that now to know if we have a business or not. So to me, FMV is.
And if I can, I need to make a formal objection on the record. And again, we walked in here today with less than a week to prepare. It's shocking, the stuff we've seen go on in the board meetings. You were concerned about sunshine laws. We are very concerned as well. There's a lot of things going on, and it seems like there's an agenda that's not on the agenda, and I don't know what it is. This board has been instructed not to communicate with the firm. This is not fair. This is not right. The board is taking actions that have direct consequences to the firm and the firm's ability to fulfill its government contracts and proudly help train the U.S. military. In a spirit of collaboration and transparency, in accordance with our collective dedication to the principles of open government and public accountability, The firm hereby requests under Article 1, Section 24 of the Florida Constitution and Chapter 119 Florida statutes, all records and communication in all forms related directly or indirectly to the firm or its leased property involving any of the board members, the airport managers, plural, current and past, the FAA, Mr. Scott Cornegay, and any third parties from January 23rd or January 2023 to present. This includes but is not limited to records and communications pertaining to leasing, construction or improvements or development of any part of the firm's property or surrounding property owned or controlled by the airport, any markup copies of any leases, any archive records or communications, including text messages. Our commitment to work together for the betterment of Keystone Heights Airport and its community remains steadfast. Thank you in advance for your commitment to transparency and effective governance, and I ask again, please reconsider and address the issues in order that we're asking, and also address the questions that I posed to the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bunn.
Thank you.
I'm going to adhere, as Mr. Van Zandt, our city manager, stated, that for this workshop, we're going to adhere to the agenda items because that's what we have to do. That doesn't mean that we're not open to discussions again at a later workshop. But I think as we walk down through these items on our agenda, there are going to be some of the issues they have concerns about addressed. So with that, I'm going to move on to our agenda under item 2.
But there's an acknowledgement that we object, yes. And that we're saying we don't know if we have a viable business because we don't understand the FAA's, the airport, my understanding is the board doesn't have the authority to overrule the FAA. The FAA has the authority to decide if they will continue to allow a non-aeronautical lease business to operate, and that the FAA holds the approval power to decide whether or not we can continue to use the track. So without understanding the mechanics of that first, to me, if we're gonna close our doors because the FAA comes back and says we're not gonna acknowledge this non-aeronautical use and we're not gonna allow you to use the track, and the third agenda of you wanna break up the lease as you stated in the November 8th public board meeting, which was news to us, I only learned that from watching it. Those are issues that we need to understand what your intentions are, what the board's intentions are, and what FAA is gonna rule. And that has nothing to do with FMV. We have to know if our doors are gonna be open or closed because we have government contracts with the military and the whole world is in war right now. And we have all these pre-deployment orders for contracts.
I need to express something. I'm sorry, I need to express something. I'm going to request at this time that the meeting be adjourned so we can reconvene with an extended items and maybe 3 weeks from now. I think that's fair. We have additional information that needs to be conveyed to this board about the fair market value. There are a lot of issues with that, with that appraisal that was done. And also, I didn't want to do this, and I do not intend to sue, but I am concerned about spoilization. So I will provide this to Mr. Taylor. It's a preservation of records for every board member. I'm very concerned about what's going on here. I do not want to do that, and I do not want to sue. I do not want to engage in litigation. But we have a lease. There's nothing more that needs to be done at this time, but this is a meeting by ambush that was been prepared for over 4 months. Mr. Kuhn, when did you first learn that there were issues with the lease?
I don't recall the exact date.
And I respect that. We talking about last week or 21 days when the FAA letter came out, or are we talking about October?
Mr. Bunn,
This is not an examination. This is a
it's not.
workshop.
Okay.
Thank you. We've heard your comment.
I would like one answer to that.
This is a workshop. It's not an examination, Mr. Bunn.
It's a workshop by ambush that you all have been preparing for 4 months.
That is
4 months.
That's
completely
correct.
untrue.
There's going to be no voting today.
That's correct.
You can't.
It's a workshop.
It's against Florida statutes.
Great. Thank you very much.
May I speak, please?
Yes.
I've really tried, because of the situation we had at the last meeting, y'all talked about aggressive. I've sat here very patiently. You've marched in here today and said you want to do this amicably. We are a landlord. You are the tenant. You don't run the show. We are here because I advocate for that track. Every event y'all have, we post on our Facebook page. We get the word out in town. You're the aggressors coming in here. I'm trying to remain as calm as I can. I understand you may be in panic mode, but you just stood up and you're speaking to somebody. You've got a soapbox going. You sound like we're already in court, and we are not, Mr. Bunn. We are a board. I can't speak for how you react to this, but if it were me, I would come hat in hand. I would be not necessarily pleading. There's no reason to plead. You have as much honor as any of these men or women at this table. But when you come in here in this aggressive manner, it's not helping y'all's cause. We're here to work out a resolution. I don't want to see this go. I've become friends with most of your employees over there. But at the end of the day, this board has governance. The city council appoints us to govern. We have a fiduciary responsibility for this airport and the success of the airport first and foremost. It is an aeronautical facility used for the landing and takeoff of aircraft. That track over there is a wonderful enhancement. But we're not going to get anywhere being accused of having secret meetings. And I'd like to ask this. Our board meetings, as long as I've been on the board, have always been open to the public. I have seen Bryn come in here to the meetings before. I've seen Raul once or twice. Where have you been in all these meetings? All this secret stuff we're going, these meetings haven't been secret. We have been here. I'm sorry that y'all appear to be in full panic mode. Has anybody told any of your employees that we're going to shut down your track, even suspend activities there right now?
You're asking me a question?
I am asking you a question.
So
Has he told you that you're suspended, you can't do any
So
activities?
my answer is that we're not in panic mode. The FAA letter says that we potentially may be in non-compliance for having a non-aeronautical lease, and FAA, as I understand it, is the governing authority, and that a portion of our track may not be used. All that we have been asking for since December is information about the process. And we were under the impression that that workshop is where we could ask questions, because you guys did not feel comfortable answering our questions about that process at the last board meeting. And you said, we'll put on a workshop. And then the agenda does not address our questions. And we would like to know the process of what your intentions are in regards to the non-compliance. That's it. And it doesn't have to be, hey, hang on one second, Scott, because I didn't interrupt you, and I appreciate you
Go
sharing.
ahead, I'm sorry.
I appreciate you sharing that you care about the track. Again, this is new information because we don't know what's in your minds unless we ask questions. We don't know what the process is for curing the potential non-compliance. So we don't even know if we're going to be allowed to operate because FAA is the governing authority. So we are just seeking information on what my letter stated. I read the FAA letter. I followed their rules. We have 30 days to respond. They mentioned some clauses in there, and that's what's in my letter. What is the next step here? Without doing that, we're putting the cart before the horse. We have to know if they're going to close our business down and say, you can't be here anymore.
Well, one thing you're wrong about, they are not the governing body here.
They don't.
We are the governing body. They are a regulatory body. And they're going to tell us what we can or cannot do. But let's face it, even if we talk about what you want to talk about, and y'all seem to be wanting to run our meeting, you're welcome to be here, and we look for your input. You're invited here. So I would think we could participate as a team, as a group. Let's all try to tow the rope in the same direction. There's going to be some things that y'all don't like. There's probably going to be some things we don't like. But we're not getting anywhere with this banner and grandstanding to the camera and whoever's watching, and I respect that. And listen, this thing about the patriotic and the government and do all this, listen, MHD Rockland does the same thing. They save lives around the world. It almost sounds like you're insinuating that we're not patriotic, and we are very patriotic.
What I'm
So
insinuating is.
hang on again now, let me finish, please. I think we would be far better. Brenda and I have worked together very well as just individuals. I can't work, when I work with Brenda, I don't work with him as a board member. I work with somebody that cares about this airport and I care about the firm. We get a lot better and a lot better things working if we're going in the same direction. Sometimes we disagree, but we still work through that. And I'm just saying, if we can just tone it down a notch, and now you're bringing up lawsuits and everything, that doesn't sound like, excuse me, that doesn't sound like you're negotiating in good faith if you're already ready to pull the nuclear button to me, sir.
Well, we didn't come here to negotiate. We came here to learn and be educated
Right.
about the
But
process.
he's talking about, I don't want to sue, but man, I tell you right now, I don't even want to talk. Now, you're talking about a lawsuit. That doesn't make me feel all warm and fuzzy. And I'd like to get this resolved for you.
If you don't,
Okay.
if I can, February 6th, 2024, Scott Fryer. Be careful what you say to them. This is going to be a legal undertaking. It's out of your words. You
I don't
expressed this
think I said a legal undertaking. I said we just need to be careful about discussing anything because we've got people that should be handling the meeting.
Be careful what you say to them over there. This is going to be a legal undertaking.
Okay, well, I'll have to go back and look at my words.
All right.
Can I say something, please?
We're going to move forward and address the items on the agenda because this board needs to be aware of the information that we're going to hit here. And that's the purpose for the workshop. So, Mr.
Can I
Ludwig,
just,
you have a
please,
comment?
just to address what Mr. Fryer's saying. And I disagree with what you're saying in the way, I understand where they're coming from. And to me, this is not that difficult. And maybe I'm looking at something wrong, but I understand for them to be upset. Because essentially everything that's coming down on them, and that's why I've been questioning this whole time myself in some of these meetings, you know, it's like all of this has been thrown on them with 30 seconds left in the game and say, okay, go ahead, figure it out. You know, you're on, you know, here it is, and then dump it in their lap. Some of you have been on this board a lot longer than we have, and long enough to know that some of these issues that are listed in this right here existed. Again, I stated it in our last meeting. For the last year, we have not talked about one non-compliance issue. We've not talked about anything negative or anything with the firm or voted on anything in that case.
And the reason why is because it didn't come out until we got that letter, Mr. Ludwig.
Okay, but again, when the appraisal came up, you know, we didn't get all of the information as far as the full terminal lease. I brought that up in our last meeting to know that there was essentially the two other periods that went along with that, or just the terms of the lease or the lease in general. We didn't have any of that as a board. That lease was not attached to our agenda. That should have been. That would have created, but it still would have created transparency. And we could have had some of these discussions then before we took that vote on that appraisal. Were they made aware that the appraisal was fixing to happen? Did they have any indication ahead of time knowing that the appraisal was going to take place?
They did.
Okay, because in the last meeting when they said that they had stopped their drill when the appraiser showed up that day, that sounded to me as if they didn't have.
They didn't have
any
stopped the drill.
Well,
That's
that
untrue.
they were over there. That led me to believe they didn't have the knowledge that this was fixing to take place over there, that he was going to be there that day.
Emailed, yes.
Okay.
We made an
So,
appointment.
well, I don't, okay, well, all I'm saying, it came across in that one is they didn't have any prior notice of that. Okay, I would be surprised too if somebody showed up to all of a sudden come start looking at my property and I didn't know what was going on.
So you do understand they had prior notice.
Okay, if everybody's in agreement on that, I don't know.
It's not a matter of whether it's agreement, Mr. Ludwig. It's the fact that Mr. Kuhn provided an email.
We never stated in this meeting that we did not have prior notice. What we stated is in our letter that we asked to exercise our rights, and we did not understand why then an appraiser was coming. So that is why, again, we have a lease with lease terms. We don't understand why those lease terms have been getting changed. And now on top of that, we have this new non-compliance letter that says we potentially, because we have a non-aeronautical lease, we don't understand the approval process or what the board intends to do to resolve the two big issues, non-aeronautical lease and we're in the safety zone. And Mr. Kirkland, you did say in a board meeting that you've been on the board for 14 years. So you were here when we did the 2012 assumption, but you just said you weren't here. So
No, I didn't say I wasn't here.
at the beginning of this meeting, you didn't say that?
No, I don't remember.
No.
that being
Okay.
said, no.
Oh,
We've
Jim
always said there
Taylor
was
said that,
There
I'm
was a
sorry,
different board.
Jim Taylor said that you weren't here during the 2012
No,
assumption.
no, I said I wasn't here in 1999. I was not counsel for the board in 1999.
Gotcha, but you were here when we went through the lease assumption in 2012.
Of course, I dealt directly with Mr. Bond.
And you were too, Mr. Kirkland. So there are prior meetings that say, well, this board didn't know or wasn't involved, but you all have been involved since 2012. And we are looking to you all as the experts with 14 years on the board to just help us understand the process to get to a resolution on the non-aeronautical lease and on the RPZ. That has been my intent. I tried to email it in December to Craig. I tried to meet with Craig to get that information. And Craig, this is not personal at you. I understand that you have marching orders and you're gonna do your job. So I'm not saying it in a negative way. Whatever your marching orders were, you were brand new on the job, maybe you didn't know, or someone else said they would be handling it, whatever. But I did try to just simply ask the landlord, hey, what is the process here? What does this mean? And I have not been to today able to get information.
Okay, I'm going to
So
I'm going to stop you
I
there.
just don't think we have been aggressive or adversarial, Scott. I think that we have made every effort to just ask very simple, basic questions, and we're not getting answers.
So I'm going to stop you there because a lot of what you just said is not correct. We have communicated about what the process is. We have shared that we are required by the FAA when there is a lease renewal, that has to go to them. That's why Mr. Kuhn provided that information to them. We did not respond in the meantime because the FAA had not given us their response. So that's where we are. We finally got the FAA response. We shared that with you. We've shared it with the board. And now we've got to take action on the potential non-compliance issue and the reason for this workshop to start that
You're
process.
choosing one of the three issues, and that's what doesn't make sense to us.
So that's our prerogative. And all of them have to be complied with. Would you not agree?
I agree that it would be nice to understand all of the process,
It
yes.
doesn't
For all
matter.
three issues.
But here's the other thing. One more thing, and I'll shut up. I promise. How do we know, how do you know it's like y'all know we're not going to renew your lease? I don't understand where you're getting that information. Or where does that idea, is somebody told you, and we don't even know if the terms are going to change. I
Well, I
mean,
can answer that question. What
but we
know-
can't even get through the workshop to discuss what our ideas are, and y'all have already decided we're not going to renew your lease.
Because we're only addressing FMV and not the other two things that we don't know. We don't know what your intentions are. We don't know what the resolution is for a non-aeronautical lease or being in the safety zone. And when we watched the November 8th meeting, we heard discussions about carving out a large portion of our current lease and not letting us have all that acreage. So these are very basic questions. And you mentioned MHD, is it Rockland?
Yeah.
I'm sure if they got a notice that they were in the same situation, I'm confident they would come and be asking the same questions as you all would if you got a letter from the FAA or from anybody saying you can't necessarily conduct business anymore because you potentially have these non-compliance issues.
Potential. Alleged. Those are words that don't have defined.
It only said potential,
Yeah.
and so we're just looking to understand the process to resolution.
Well, how can we do that if we can't even get through this? Can we just talk about what our agenda is today? And then if y'all got questions at the end of it, or we can have interaction during it, and please don't threaten to sue us again. Let's just talk. Can we just do that?
That's all I want. I don't want to sue
Well,
anybody.
it doesn't sound like it,
Just
but
like we're gonna get sued and say, hey, we owe more money or whatever, when we have agreement, there was commitments that was made by a handshake and a, independent confirmation and a lease that the rent wouldn't go up. So why would we, anyone who engages with the firm here on out, if there's a renewal, there's no renewal. It's a complete new revision. But relating to the fair market value, the firm did give notice on February 8th The firm is aware of facts and circumstances important to take into consideration which are relevant to the analysis conducted and presented in the appraisal. The firm feels it is important to present certain material facts to the FAA reviewer, which will impact things such as fair market value prior to the FAA accepting its appraisal by Albright and Associates of Ocala in its current state. It seems very clear that it was the board who contacted the FAA, which is fine, but we're right next door. No one ever told us there's an issue.
You're not
So this is
hearing.
really weird that
You're not hearing things, are you? We had to call the FAA.
But you didn't
This has
call
been said a
us, is
dozen
my
times.
point. You've had 4.
We're not obligated to
today, but
contact
no
you.
one called us.
But we're not
Has
obligated.
anyone told me you intend to carve out the lease? Mr. Kuhn, do you have any markup copies or anybody here any markup copies of the lease of what you all intend to do? Because I've never seen a map. I've never seen any proposed amendments. I mean, if there's any markup leases, I'd like to see, because no one's told us.
Can I make it simple for you?
Sure, please.
Do you know that, so when the federal government sold this airport to the city of Keystone Heights for $1, do you know the federal government has the right, if we go into a war and it's on our land,
To reclaim it.
they can reclaim this airport?
We do know
Do you
that.
think they care what we think?
I think they care.
Do
They
you
were
think
trained
they
in the
care?
military, I think.
Okay, well, you keep bringing that up. Hoorah, let's run up the flag. That's great, we're all patriotic. Please quit that, please. But do you also know, because it sounds like you're an aviation attorney. For instance, in our T hangars, if we don't have enough business requests, if we don't have enough people coming with airplanes to lease those hangars, we can use those for non-aeronautical use. But there must not be anybody wanting them. If that demand changes, and you correct me if I'm wrong, those non-aeronautical businesses have to move or can be subject to moving. The same thing happens to any land on this airport. If there becomes an aeronautical need, then there becomes a conflict. And the federal government or the FAA, what their premise is that the airport is designed for aeronautical activity. Therefore, we would like when potential tenants come in, that you make that land available to them. And again, I would yield to.
That's correct.
I would yield to, and that is correct. Another thing that occurs, you've got portable buildings over there. You've got what we know as mobile homes, but they're offices. And they are mobile. They are not built into the ground, but we have people, he's already encountered probably 4 of them since he's been here. We have people come here and they solicit the airport wanting to build a structure on the airport, such as a hangar. What they don't know is, a lot of them don't know, and as soon as they find this out, they run. They can build the hangar, they can lease the land from us. They pay an amortized loan out, and hopefully they better not do it for 20 years or more, because in 20 years, that building becomes ours. That's not a Keystone Airport Authority thing, that's an FAA thing. So the problem where that hurts us is banks won't loan on structures that are going to go on an FAA federal airport. They don't want to get caught up in something they can't repossess. Does that make sense? So there's a lot that you don't know that we know, but I think if we could just work together and let's just calm it down, just take some deep breaths. I know I did before I got here because I thought about what you told me the other night, that I come off kind of aggressive. I want to work through this. I want y'all to be able to stay. I want the people that work for y'all to be able to stay in this community. I want y'all to continue to contribute to the success of the local businesses. But we're not going to get there if we're just arguing over even getting this started. We've got to start somewhere. And if you think we've got it backwards, so be it. But it's still got to be addressed. It's all part of the puzzle to me.
The last thing I have to
appreciate
say,
you taking the time to share all that information and give us this educational information. And that's all we're looking for. Let's share the same information about what the next steps are to resolve the non-aeronautical potential non-compliance and what the next steps are to resolve the potential track in the safety zone. And if you would just take the same time that you just did, giving us the full education of how aviation works and just spend a little bit of time just saying, here's the process and here's what our intention is, that would help us a lot understand our business model.
Right.
And that's the purpose for this workshop, for all of us to gain a better understanding of the things that we need to do in order to come up with a resolution that can be included with a letter to the FAA saying, here's what we're doing to address the potential non-compliance issues.
But you're only picking one of the three topics the FAA has.
Today's time
And I've got to start somewhere. So
today's
we're going
time
to start
constraints.
here.
Yeah, but we didn't mention that in our last meeting. You did, in all fairness, you said, y'all kept saying, both of you kept pushing, saying, let's not do this in this meeting, we're gonna have a workshop, this will all be better in a workshop.
Correct.
Because I'm under the same impression as well coming in here today, and I don't know what anybody else thought, but, you know, it sounded like we were gonna come in and talk about all of these. Yes, we still have to have certain things that need to come out of this, but that all this was gonna be more than just discussing just this one portion, and then just keep stretching this thing out.
Well, and here's why, because the fair market value rent discussion encompasses the rest of that, as far as the number of acres, whether or not we develop two parcels out of it, or some other ideas and options that we can discuss. That's the reason for having this workshop with these agenda items, because that affects the rest of it. They all work together, okay? They all combine together.
Mr.
But we've
Kirkland,
got to start somewhere, and
You
Ms.
wanna
Hines,
address-
I appreciate,
but I wanna-
no, I appreciate it, but we're going to move
How
on.
can we pay fair market value or discuss fair market value when we don't even know how many acres you plan on?
That'll be
continuing?
discussed.
But you're trying to establish a rent base on an appraisal that was done for 285 acres, but you have plans or ideas that you might not let us rent 285 acres, so how can you possibly decide fair market value? That appraiser
Well,
would.
what if you said we can't afford to pay that,
Well-
and we said, well, you can give up some of this land?
Okay.
That's what the
But
discussion
the
is.
appraisal was done on 285 acres as fair market value. But now you're talking about, you just stated that you may take some of the acreage back. So an
It's a
appraisal,
discussion.
okay, but an appraisal would have to be done on the actual leased land that you plan on leasing to us. And you would have to propose to us the rent you plan on charging for the land that you plan on leasing to us, which you've just stated is not 285 acres possibly.
So that's an option.
Okay,
The appraisal was done per the FAA regulations on the 285 acres of what you presently have. So that's the starting point. And obviously, we've seen from the numbers, you know, we all took a deep breath when we saw the numbers, but they're the numbers, they're the facts.
for the
So-
record, me personally, I have no issue with the board following their fiduciary responsibility, and I understand the fair market value process. That's not what we are coming to you today about. That is a negotiation, and we understand that. What I don't understand is why we can spend so much time educating us on so many things about the airport, but we can't stay focused on the three potential non-compliance issues that the FAA has said that we're in non-compliance.
And that's what I'm trying to do, is get
One
as,
of three
that's-
issues, and now there's the fourth, that you want to discuss fair market value on an appraisal done for 285 acres, but you might not let us lease 285 acres.
How are you gonna find that out if you can't be quiet long enough to do it?
I'm sorry, if I may.
To discuss it.
Just since if I may. One of the options that I think Mr. Kirkland intended to present this afternoon for discussion is if we take the fair market value rent over the entire 285 acres, and the resulting rent is something that firm feels it cannot pay, then we would need to look at some options on how to address that so that we have a situation where, the board is complying with its fiduciary responsibility and is preparing itself to answer to the FAA in a way that will gain the FAA's approval. And on the other hand, firm has a rent amount that it can manage. And one option would be, well, let's look at maybe reducing the scope of the leased acreage because, on a per acre, when the rent is determined on a per acre value, the fewer acres one rents, the lower the rent's going to be. And I talked with Mr. Albright, the appraiser, about that to ask him if that were a potential outcome here. Whether the per acre valuation in his appraisal would change if the total of the appraised acreage was not 285 acres, but something less than that. And his answer was he did not see that there would be a per acre change because of a reduction in the acreage. So that's just one option that had been identified and therefore was intended today to be presented to the board as a discussion item with input from firm as to whether, if to achieve fair market value rent in such a way that is financially manageable for firm, we could consider as one option to simply reduce the acreage if we could identify acreage that the firm really didn't need for its operations and could give up, and so thereby reduce the overall rent burden. That was the idea. And again, I think Mr. Kirkland intended that that be an option that would be vetted sometime during this workshop.
That's correct.
Among other options.
Okay.
So that's the context in which all of that arises today.
And I appreciate that. I think that because this is in a flood zone and I have a FEMA map that shows how much of the area is flooded, that a per acre price would vary depending upon what acreage is carved out.
Well, respectfully, I think we're going to have to rely on what Mr. Albright says about that.
Well, Mr. Albright wasn't given all the information.
And we're gonna request that we get an appraisal.
Code says fair market value only.
I
All
have a
right.
question too, excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
How many workshops is this going to entail? Because I thought,
Excellent question.
That's a great question.
because I mean, how many, are we gonna pick apart each subject for 3 or 4 hours? Seriously, I didn't know, I thought this was going to be a workshop where we're going to discuss everything. Now, the agenda states otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm confused.
I just want you to see the FEMA map. This is pulled off of FEMA. Do you see all the flooding? If you try to take parts of the land that's not flooding, and yes, we are speaking to the camera because as we were very transparent, we have people who have a financial and otherwise interest.
Watching. Conversation's giving input.
So they want to see what we're saying and doing. But this is all, these are lakes. So if you have wetlands, that cannot be valued at the same rate as our track. And also in reading the lease, leasehold improvements cannot be considered. And he didn't consider it. However, I just want to also say in 1999, I was told, and Brent can speak to this, but they begged Iver to be out here because it was just wetlands. There was nothing out there. And it's still wetlands. That hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed are the improvements that we've made. So these are the type of things. I never stated that his appraisal wasn't correct. What I stated precisely was, I believe that Mr. Albright was selectively given information or not given all the information. For example, I think that's why he has the wrong rent amount. And you have to understand from our perspective, the appraiser is saying we're not paying the right rent amount, and we know that appraisal went to the FAA. So that's creating a picture for the FAA from Jumpstart about what kind of tenant we are, right? So it's a logic puzzle for us. Logically, there are things that we would like to understand, and we do want to work with you. I am not at all asking anything other than we would like to know all 3 issues and have them answered. And I did send that out prior to the agenda. And if you guys didn't plan on doing it here, respectfully for your time and ours, I would have liked you to say, we were not prepared to discuss these other 2 things. So let's give us some time to work together, and we will schedule another date when we can address all 3 issues in the letter, because we have to get a response to them in 30 days.
Well, our issue with the potential noncompliance of the RPC, the tracking intrusion, is that we've got to have the FAA tell us specifically what we can do about that.
Well,
So that's the
new
reason.
And that's the kind of stuff that we would like to talk about today. What
Okay,
is all the information?
so I've just told you that we have to have the FAA input on that. And until we get that, then we've got to talk about something else.
Well, no.
Of the two non-compliance.
Aeronautical study. So has this been done?
I'm not going to get into, is that the FAA letter?
This is the FAA letter.
Okay, well, then you'd have to address that to Mr. Allen,
Who's Mr. Allen?
the one that signed the letter.
Oh, so
Ryan
you're
Allen.
recommending that we get the information directly from the FAA?
You had a question about that. I can't speak for the FAA.
No, I have a question about the letter that the FAA delivered to Mr. Kuhn and said Mr. Kuhn had 30 days to respond. And in that letter, they said an aeronautical study, so I was wondering if that had been done. Has Form 746-1 been uploaded to FAA and what the next steps are?
Do you
So
remember
I
what we
wanna-
said at the other meeting the other night?
Do what?
All that letter that the FAA needs within that 30 days is
Right.
just to say, we're working on it.
Okay,
That's all it is.
okay,
That's not a deadline.
okay.
When that letter is due to the FAA, you're not getting kicked out. We're not getting kicked off the board. The airport's not being blown up. It's just a letter to say, you have received these potential discrepancies, and do you agree to work on them? That's all that is. I think maybe that's where this frustration is coming, that y'all feel like you're under the gun. Is
But I
that?
don't think I'm coming across as frustrated at all. I think I'm coming.
You're
across-
excited. Y'all have been very excited.
I do not believe that I am very excited.
You are very excited.
I think that I'm just asking questions about the letter that we received.
You are, but you're just, it looks like we're going in circles. And if
Okay.
we don't start here and
Okay.
move forward, we're not going to get anything done.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fryer, thank you, Ms. Hines. We're going to move forward. I want to look at A. Option, possible options, defend adequacy of current rent under the lease. Otherwise, propose no change. How do we defend that? And this is to the board. How do we defend that to the FAA? I made some notes. The FAA stated in their letter that the airport may not currently be receiving fair market value compensation in exchange for the non-aeronautical lease agreements. They've stated that in their letter.
So my thought is twofold. It is apparently for what they're paying right now, it is very underrated. So would they look at us as giving away the farm? The second half of that is, we didn't enter into this legal contract with the firm or the European rally, wherever it started at, and I don't know what the ramifications of that contractual language are. Can we be bound by that? In other words, who would have the override? Would the FAA have the authority to tell a court, no, you can't uphold their lease? That's where I get confused. I see what they're saying. They've got a legal contract that they signed, but then the FAA has got this big heavy hand and says, no, you as a board are doing a disservice to the maintenance of that airfield and the assurance of your future grants by not getting enough money.
So the FAA addresses that with the grant assurance 24, which deals with fee and rental structure. They also refer to grant assurance 25 and airport revenue. So they've given us parameters based on their documents that we have to adhere to and their guidance. So that's the question. That doesn't mean that we can't go back to the FAA and say, hey, we think they're paying a fair rate.
Or that right, wrong, or indifferent, there was a contract entered into agreement and the hands were shook, and we think we're bound by the courts to maintain that.
Well, may I address that?
Well,
Yes.
The lease addresses this point. Paragraph 14 of the lease, and I'm referring to the 1990 lease, which is still in effect now, which is, that section is entitled Subordination and Review. And it states, among other things, This lease is subject to review by the Federal Aviation Administration, and the parties, that's the landlord and the tenant, shall modify this lease as required pursuant to such review. So the option that Mr. Kirkland has presented is that the board potentially could respond to this notice of potential noncompliance as it concerns the fair market rent issue, to say, we think the rent is adequate and should not be changed. And if the FAA were to agree, then that would comply with this lease provision. If that were not a viable option to present to the FAA, then we need to start looking at other options. So it seems to me the starting point to evaluate its options as it concerns fair market value rent is, the lease says what it says. Should we just stick with what the lease says? Or because the FAA has noted the noncompliance, are we going to be required, or the parties going to be required to modify the lease so that it's fair market value rent? We had an appraisal in 1999,
Right.
reporting that at the time the rent was fair market value. We have an appraisal now, which on the face of it indicates that it's not fair market value. So if we think nonetheless that it is fair market value, one potential option is to try to defend the current rent to the FAA. And so to me, that's the first option to explore. Are there reasons why we should argue against the appraisal and argue that the 1.5% annual increase has resulted, sitting here in 2024, with what is still fair market value rent, as it was when the lease started in 1999. That's the issue.
Well, it seems to me that, well, it's interesting. This lease shall be subordinate to the provisions, as you just read, of any existing future agreements. But as the appraisal was done in 99 for the lease that was established at that time, I guess everything seemed to be in agreement with the appraisal and the lease as it was written. It appears from the appraisal that was recently done that times have changed on valuation of land, just like it has with every other piece of land. To just argue that the lease is, the appraisal that was done back in 1999 valuation is still the same valuation for today, doesn't really seem to hold water to me.
Let me,
I think the current appraisal is probably more accurate for today.
is the current rent right now, the annual, am I reading this form right, $116,192 annually?
Yes.
Wait,
Okay.
that's what the appraisal said.
No.
That's not what our
No.
agencies say.
No, the appraisal said 90,000.
That's from,
I'm looking at your annual, looks like it's 26,192. So if I divide that by 285 acres, is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, and then I divide that out by 12. Is everyone aware that that's $7.63 an acre per month? Does anybody know where you could go and, I'd like to know if I could lease some land for $7.63 a month
Can I say something?
per acre.
I have no idea.
Yes,
Can I say something? Sure, please. Not all those acreage we use.
right,
It's got trees on it.
Right.
It's got ditches on it.
yeah,
So it's not an actual good number.
right,
That's not what we use. In fact, we manage and we spend a lot of money trying to keep that nice.
right.
So every acre that we have, I would say probably 3/4 of it, we never even touch because we can't. Because
Okay, so let's go with
it's on
that.
trees.
Let's go with that.
So,
Well, so the appraisal is based on 285
yeah,
acres.
and I'd say 38% we cannot use because it's over that condition.
So if we took 285 and you're saying just take 25, what'd you say, about 75%?
I'm thinking probably-
I'm just throwing a number
I'm
out.
throwing number two, but I'm saying.
You want to say 30% of it's usable?
Huh?
30% usable with roads, track area, offices?
Maybe.
I have a quick comment. The appraisal that was done does not take into consideration where the track is in terms of that zone area that's a problem. And addressing that's gonna diminish the value of that. And also, I think it's appropriate again to have a second appraisal. And the appraisal also doesn't take into account the timber rights and the enormous amount of money that has to be spent anytime that the timber is used.
Well, just to clarify, the appraisal does mention the timber rights. However, as the board stated in the last meeting, you all didn't know, neither did we, when you remove a tree, they can suck up to 150, one tree up to 150 gallons of water a day. So we're already in wetlands, low-level land, and the only way to know how much
It's not a day. I think it was 600 gallons a year.
well,
Between 150 and 500 gallons.
Well,
we can Google it, but the
So,
bottom line is
yeah.
that the timber harvesting has exacerbated the flooding issue to the point where the shop floods and many areas of the trail also flood. And we have to spend a significant amount of resource either re-diverting our class to different areas or building up the road that gets flooded out and turns into a lake.
So I've been here 20 years, and I'm the one that's done most of that work to get things.
And he has.
in the right place. I've been here longer than most people have been on this airport, so I do know that side really well. And those things do become an issue.
And the
So we
water
spend a
you've
lot of
diverted has actually helped the airfield at
It
times
does help
too.
the airfield, like I think
It
we did
does.
last year.
There's a mutual benefit.
We did the end of the runway, that really helped the drainage off the end of the runway. And that's a combined effort
Right.
between both of us.
So when I get back to, I took it down to 30%, which was about 85 acres. That still comes out at $25.60 a month per acre.
And
So-
additionally, the cost of a contractor to come in and rip up that track.
We're not talking about that now. We're just talking about
Should be
land.
taken into consideration with the appraisal.
We haven't even gotten there yet.
Well, just to.
We're just talking about the money.
Just to talk about how you're calculating it, so the company, Matchin, I can't remember, but in the board meeting, you all were given the name of an appraiser in Miami, and then they referred you to Albright. So if you look on that appraiser's website, you'll see that they have valuations as low as 40 cents an acre. So I agree, like, I understand what you're doing with the calculations, but I was surprised that for this type of land, that they were saying sometimes it could be low as 40 cents. So
That
it's
would
not,
probably be swampland though, probably, wouldn't it?
well, we have swampland. I
Well,
mean, that's what the.
but that's
FEMA map-
speculation.
The way that.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, but that's speculation.
Yeah.
Let's deal with what we know, the facts that we have. So
And
back,
don't you have-
back,
One more thing, don't you have another appraisal? So we're talking about 1999, but you guys mentioned in a board meeting that you had an appraisal from another time period.
that was an appraisal for the Sportsman's Club, different part of the airport.
Can we see a copy of that? Also, wasn't this approved in the master plan in 2016?
What was water approved?
The track and where it was and what have you, and wasn't that all approved in 2016?
I don't recall that it being listed in the master plan,
What?
even as a non-aeronautical, but
The track.
So the FAA doesn't have a copy of our lease prior to sending it
The
to
master
them?
plan examines aeronautical movement and building for aeronautical.
So that map, showing our track and stuff, they don't have in the master plan?
yes, that's part of the master plan.
It would be part of it, but like for
Okay.
budgetary,
Uh-huh.
when they're focusing on our future grants, they're looking at where they'll put new taxiways or where they'll put new hangars, or one of the things is the drainage. That is a project coming up, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
So that's more what the master plan deals with.
okay.
All right, so back to our discussion here. How do we defend that, or can we defend it? That's the question.
Well, that's what I was
Given-
getting at with this price here. If it was whether it's the $7.60 a month or $25.60 a month, where could you go around here and lease land
Well,
per
Well,
acre?
I
I don't know,
don't-
maybe that's a
Based
viable-
upon the recent appraisal. I find it very hard to defend maintaining the rental structure that was established 25 years ago.
I guess my question would be, what are other people paying price per acre, like Sportsman's Club? Like, we would have to see their lease and how many acres they have and how much their rent is. Because you're talking about defending what you're doing, but in order to do that, I would like to see the other acreage leases and what their valuation is.
And it's been expressed to the board that we got a sweetheart deal. I don't think anyone's taking into consideration the significant amount of money that we had to pay to assume that lease.
And you
We did
knew,
not
and
get a
you knew
sweetheart
that,
deal.
and you knew that when you assumed it.
That's exactly right.
business, right?
But we also assumed based upon the word of the chairman. If you say something to me, can I take your word to the bank?
Can you,
Yes or no? I'm just asking. You can take my word to the bank. If I will tell you what I know, what I don't know, what I think, and I will always distinguish which is which. And I will be honest, truthful, and outright. If I say something, you can take it to the bank. If you say something and represent something to me, can I take that to the bank? Okay. So that's what happened with the prior chairman. But now it sounds like everyone's saying, well, we weren't part of that. So we entered into negotiation with the board, not the individuals here. So,
All right, so moving on. Let's move on.
So,
What's the
Scott,
board, I'm
can I
sorry.
riff on what you
No,
said?
no, please. We're going to move on. Board, for this first item here, can we logically defend leaving the current rent in place?
I don't think you can.
I think my opinion.
I don't think
is
so.
The fact that the lease was what it was, or what it is, what it actually is that essentially a 50-year lease. I think that may be something that could potentially be, because again, this is what any tenant would be basing their future on, from budget for whatever their business is, and I believe that when you believe that your lease says one thing, that this was what was agreed to, that it's kind of like not changing the rules in the middle of the game, and you stick to that lease, because that way you can set your budget forward through the future in knowing that this is what it's going to be. That's my opinion of it.
Should they still be charging the same prices they did back in 1999 or 2012 for a rental of a car?
I'm just saying,
Well,
the lease is written. I mean, the lease is there. We have it.
Well, he
We know
told
what
you
it
that
is.
that could be changed. It's defendable that it could.
this was, we were informed in 2012. There's no need to talk about 1999. 2012, the board represented to us, we will not change your rates. So when you talk about 25 years ago, and things have changed, we're talking about 2012 to now. And again, if I can keep your word, if you gave me your word right now, if the board's not willing to keep their word in a contractual agreement, let alone a handshake, then what integrity is there on the board?
so you took upon a sublease from European Rally. That's just part of what was listed in there. But as Mr. Taylor said, there are some issues, there are some exceptions, and that's why we need to talk about this. As we've explained, we are told by the FAA, these are the things that you have to do when there's a lease renewal. They want to know about it. And then they tell us, okay, you need that appraisal done by a certified person that meets all those FAA credentials that they list, as well as all of the other credentials with appraising. So we've done that. And so that's where we're at. So we have that number. It's substantially different. And I think the FAA recognized that as well, because they saw the appraisal. The question for us, because there's some other options here I want us to talk about. But the first one, we need to come to some sort of consensus. Can we really defend the current rate?
Well, when we keep talking about this with the lease, and this is where I'm trying to understand, because the fact that it does include the other two periods, is it truly a renewal, or is it just that if the leasee decided that after 24 years, they didn't want to be here anymore, they could leave, they could pack up and leave? Because it is clearly says that they have at their desire, if they want to continue those other 2 periods, that essentially it's a 50-year lease if that's what they want. That's where I'm having the hard time understanding this, because it's kind of like, well, that's why the FAA has to be involved. We're going at this like it's all brand new renewal, like they had a 25-year contract, that was it, and now they're looking at wanting to stay another however long, then now we got to negotiate a new contract. And that's where I'm having the hard time understanding because of what is already there.
The lease in its initial term and its renewal terms is subject at all times to compliance with FAA rules and regulations and subject to FAA review and modification by the landlord and the tenant to comply with whatever the results are of FAA review. So I think, Mr. Ludwig, that's the answer to your question.
And I understand that
The
it's
answer
at
is right
all
there.
times.
The answer is right there in the lease.
But I mean, I would look at any other business that comes to an airport and be hesitant to want to come build a business or have a business at the airport because the FAA can just come in there and change it up in the middle of the game at any given time for anybody.
That may be so, but that's what the lease says. And that's what, to my knowledge, all of the airport's leases say.
That's correct.
As they must, as they must.
I would agree with you. There's things the FAA, I mean, what incentive, after the example I gave them about why would I want to come and spend $500,000 or $1 million on a building only to know it wouldn't be mine in 20 years? That's not very good incentive either, but it's the FAA's rules.
Right.
I wouldn't say I would agree with everything they do by any means, but
Both parties to the lease are subject to the risk that at some time during the lease term, the FAA may say, what you're doing under this lease is not satisfactory to the FAA. And we've got to respond to that, and the tenant has to respond to that, no matter how it may affect either or both of us.
And don't we
Mr.
discuss
Seaman?
that first?
I look at the lease, and I was licensed real estate agent in the state of Florida. And I look at it as this was a 50-year lease. So the FAA would not have looked at this at 25 years. They would have looked at it at 50 years, where it states in here, whatever the date is, that it would be redone. I saw it in here and now I can't find it. But anyway, they, that's just the starting on it. But anyway, the way I look at this is that this is a 50-year lease, and it was broken down into 3 sections due to viability of what they were wanting to perform. When the firm took it over, they could have came back, like Mr. Ludwig said, at the end of the 25 years and said, we don't want to automatically renew, because that's what it is an automatic renewal. It's not we're going to renegotiate the lease. It is an automatic renewal for the whole 50 years. And it says in here, a whole 50 years.
Term 1 on page 1 is where it says it. It says number 1, term and renewal.
Okay.
And I agree for.
So, please.
Yes.
So, we, for whatever reason, decided that we wanted to renegotiate the lease. We don't have the right according to this. You being an attorney knows that a legal and binding copy is a legal and binding copy. You're not the FAA. The FAA did not know anything other than what we requested.
Well, they've had a copy of the lease.
They've got
Well, that's what I'm saying.
They've had it since day one.
Okay?
Yeah.
If they would have looked at it and said, oh, well, at the automatic renewal after 25 years, we're going to jump in there and force a fair market value on it. The people that negotiated this to begin with did a poor job of negotiating for the airport.
I agree on that. Now then, with that thought in mind, perhaps what might be prudent is to ask the folks at FAA, have you realized exactly how this particular lease was written?
Exactly. This shouldn't have come up as a renewal because it wasn't a renewal. It was an extension for the next 15 years. And then after that, an extension for another 10 years, which would have made the whole entire lease 50 years.
It's an option to renew, it's not it says it's an option to renew, it doesn't say it's an extension.
Yeah, the
That's
option.
true, it's an option.
And it's up to the
The
leasee,
leasee's desire is what it says there.
you know, or the leaseor, not the leasee. It's not up to us to say whether or not they can renew the lease. It was up to them to renew the lease. And
Yeah, I don't know.
you need to read it.
Well, I'm not an attorney, and we sent that document to the FAA for their review.
And they said to come back and do the appraisal?
The appraisal is part of
Okay, that's what I'm,
any renewal of lease.
That's right. The thing of it is that I
Wait a
think
minute,
that we
Rex, wait a
jumped
minute,
the gun.
wait a minute. Listen here. Ending in May of 2024.
May 31st.
That's the first 25.
That's the first 25.
That's
Now,
right.
Read beyond that, read beyond that, though.
There is, oh, I understand that.
Right.
Covenants and stipulations set forth, the tenant shall have the option to renew the lease for 2 additional periods, with the first period beginning for the additional 15 years and the second option period being for the 10 years. As a condition of the lease,
That renewal has to be at the new fair market value amount, though.
Yeah.
They can renew the lease, you just have to pay the fair market value. It's not that complicated.
We vehemently disagree.
Well, I'm sure you would. All right. So here's one of the things that we need to be aware of.
If I may, to try to frame this particular issue, what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Seymour, and Mr. Ludwig, I think as well with you, is that in your view, there should be no change in the rent over and above the annual 1.5% escalation that occurs. And so that should be the board's response to the FAA, that the lease is the basis for proposing to the FAA that there be no change, that the appraisal be disregarded. The December 2023 appraisal be disregarded. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, I'm just trying to frame how you would go back to the FAA on that.
I wouldn't have had the appraisal done to begin with.
That's done. It's done, though. So
I understand that.
But again, if we would have had all of this up front.
If we would have had all of this to begin with, I would have been against it, and I would have spoke out against it and said, it doesn't make sense to spend money on an appraisal, especially the kind of money that we spent, when, in my opinion, and I'm not an attorney, that it's an automatic renewal at the discretion of the leasees or leasees.
All right, I hear what you're saying.
And that would have negated any FAA looking into this, coming out and saying, now that we have a problem with the RPZ, the RLOP, and the TLOP.
The one thing I think might be a concern about that approach is, as I understand the airport's responsibilities to the FAA as sponsor, one of those responsibilities that the FAA expects that we will police is that at any given point in time, as best we can determine, the non-aeronautical leases we have are fair market value rent. Not just that it was in 1999 at the commencement of this particular lease relationship, but really continuously through the lease term. And the FAA speaks to that in terms of trying to ensure at the outset of a particular lease relationship that it is fair market value at that time, and that there are escalation provisions or some mechanisms built into the lease that will assure over time that it remains fair market value rent. And so I wasn't counsel to the board at the time, and none of you board members were board members at the time, but I'm going to assume that the 1.5% annual escalation was considered at that time to be adequate to ensure that fair market value rent would continue to be charged on that lease throughout the term. And so I do believe that it was a reasonable exercise of the airport's stewardship and its responsibility to the FAA that seeing the initial term of this lease coming to expiration and being aware of the firm's likely exercise of the option, the first option, to extend the term, that was an appropriate time to have an appraisal done to try to ascertain whether the 1.5% annual escalation has in fact kept track with changes in fair market value. And so
I totally agree with you at that point. But the problem is now is that the FAA has an appraisal that says it's 10 times more.
Well, not 10 times.
Well, whatever.
3 to 4.
3.5 times.
It has that, and it also has where it says here that they were made aware of several of the non-compliance issues, and that's...
Well, no, the airport made FAA aware that it had done an appraisal and provided the appraisal. So that was just the logical next step to getting the appraisal to try to ascertain whether the lease's mechanism for maintaining fair market value rent through the term of the lease, that is the 1.5% annual escalation, to see whether that had been a correct forecast of increase in fair market value when it was made and incorporated into the lease in 1999. And so if we're going to get the appraisal, the whole purpose of the appraisal was to inform us and then to inform FAA. That's the relationship we have with the FAA.
I think what we're saying, and I'm only speaking for him, and I'll let Mr. Seymour respond as well there, but again, it's if we would have had all of this and we would have been having this exact discussion we are having right now prior to us voting, if we wanted to have an appraisal or not, that's been my biggest.
The appraisal had to be done no matter what.
If we would have seen all of this and we would have discussed it as a board, then maybe it would have and maybe it wouldn't have.
No, there's no maybe about it.
Again, if it says, if it's full length, 50-year term, okay.
The term expires in May of 2024.
With the option.
With the option of
With
the
an option.
tenant, not the option of the leaser. Okay, one of the things we have that says leasee, the other says whatever, leasee, leaseor. But one says-
The
it
first
says
term
the tenant has it,
expires
but it says-
on a particular date.
And that's
I don't
my
think
legal
there's any,
term, or is the tenant.
I don't think there's a quarrel from anybody in this room that the lease has extension options, and they are the option of the tenant. We don't control whether the tenant exercises the option or not. We've received notice from firm that they've elected to exercise their option to take the first renewal term. I don't think anybody quarrels with that. I don't. The question is, was it a responsible thing? It might even have been a necessary thing. But even if it weren't necessary, was it a responsible thing for the airport at this juncture in the lease relationship to attempt to ascertain whether the requirement of fair market value rent is still being complied with as it was at the outset of the lease? Getting back to what I've said several times now already, did the 1.5% escalation adequately account for increase in fair market value in fact?
No.
And
It didn't.
and it didn't. Right. And so that's where we are.
And what I'm trying to say is that if this would have been given to us before we voted on it, I would have recommended that we sit down with the firm and say, look, we know that the rent's too low, that you should be paying more. Now, we have an option. Okay? We can reduce the amount of land that you're doing. If you have land that you're not using, carve it out to make it less. I believe that the cart was put before the horse by getting the appraisal, where we could have sat down with them and negotiated in good faith and possibly avoided litigation.
Well, we're still trying to avoid litigation, and I hope we can.
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't see where we're not going to end up in litigation.
If I may, let me address the point you just made. Because to a certain extent, I agree with you. The problem, however, with having done it in that order, we wouldn't know what to negotiate with firm about in terms of what can we do to get to a fair market value rent, because we didn't know what the fair market value rent was. We know what it is now. If we accept the appraisal, we do. And I know, because I've looked into it and I've talked with Mr. Albright, his appraisal methodology is the exact appraisal methodology that the FAA requires for these types of appraisals. He appraised the underlying land value as a ground lease, and then he divided that or multiplied that by a percentage representing a cap rate. And he used the lower of the cap rates that are the FAA's preferred range of 8 to 12. He didn't use 12%, which would have produced a higher fair market value. He used the 2 percentage points at the low end of the range, 8 and 9. But so he did the appraisal, we have that value, and now we know what we can sit down with firm and try to discuss with them in terms of how can we accommodate a fair market value rent with your lease. Can we reduce some of the acreage to reduce the rent burden at fair market value rent per acre? That's one option. Can we phase in an escalation in the rents that would be more than the 1.5% a year that will get us to fair market value rent in a reasonable period of time? Could we do some combination of those things? Those are all options that this workshop was intended to explore. And I would like to think that within those range of options, and maybe there are others, that we could work something out that we could justify to the FAA and that firm could manage in terms of its own financial resources so that we could go forward on this together, not against one another. That's what this workshop was intended to be. So I understand your point. You wanted to negotiate without knowing, the way I look at it, you wanted to negotiate with firm without knowing what we had to achieve in that negotiation in terms of how much value we were going to get out of the lease so that we could justify to FAA that we are still charging fair market value rent.
I'll tell you what fair market value is, just like selling a house. It's whatever somebody's willing to pay you. That establishes fair market value.
And Mr. Seymour, I understand that.
That is absolutely the truth.
Even if I accept that, the FAA won't. Because the only thing, and they tell this.
Before that, it's an opinion. You can list the property anywhere in the world for $1 gazillion. And if nobody pays you $1 gazillion, it's not worth $1 gazillion. But if you have that same property and you say it's worth $500,000, you may get somebody to pay you $500,000 for it. But until the actual in hand is done, it's like going auto shopping. Until you finally get through with all the paperwork, that decides the value of that vehicle. It's the same thing with the land. And all I'm going to say, one other thing before I'm interrupted, the only thing that we can really honestly, truly talk about today is the fair market value. And if it changes because of the different amount of land that they're going to be using, then we're just spinning our tires and doing nothing.
But Mr. Albright told Mr. Taylor that if that acreage amount was reduced, there would not be a change in that value that he placed on it.
So even if they went to 85 acres, they would still have to pay the...
Well, Rex, he listed it as a per acre valuation. Okay, now, like Mr. Taylor mentioned, that the individual who did this appraisal uses the formulas that the FAA have established for valuation of use of property on an airport, okay? Whatever valuation that everybody uses throughout the community may be different, but that's what they've accepted to use for airport valuations. And that's what we need to kind of look at and come to an agreement on here, is something that we have confidence that it'll meet the FAA's expectations.
Well, then I then look at it and go, what it says here, B, propose immediate increase in rent to FMV as in the appraisal. If you're saying that, then that's the only option we have, is to go straight to option B.
No, so what we can do with that is, I want to discuss that, so let's move to that. Before we move off of A, though, just let me remind all of us, whether it's A, B, or C, that one of the things we have to be aware of with a non-compliance, any kind of non-compliance that we have, we've got to be careful that does not jeopardize our existing and the future grants that we have.
Can I comment on the last issue
with the
before we move forward?
FAA? After I finish, please. Thank you, Mr. Bunn. So let's be aware of that as well, because what that amounts to with 17 projects that we have between 2024 and 2030, that's $19.7 million. And the FAA controls that. Yeah. The FDOT controls that. So just almost to be aware that there is a reason for us complying with the FAA.
Oh, I understand that we have to comply with the FAA. I'm just saying that if we have to comply with the FAA, then our only response is option B.
Well, if I may, if we had no consideration of firms' concerns, particularly whatever additional, financial burdens this may place on the firm, and whether that's doable for them, I don't know. But if we had no interest in the firm's position on all of this, I think that would be our response. We would tell the FAA, we're going to immediately increase the rent to what we now believe, based on Albright's appraisal, is fair market value rent. But I do think we have some latitude. The FAA will in the end tell us, but I think we have some latitude perhaps to go back to the FAA. If firm, you can demonstrate the financial difficulty this might present if we were to immediately increase the rent by 3.5 times, that we might be able to go back to the FAA and propose something like a phased-in escalation of the rent, more than the current 1.5%, a greater percentage annual increase so that we can more quickly get up to fair market value rent that might give the firm some breathing space to bear that burden.
And I see where it's amortized over the 5 years of getting up there.
So that spreadsheet just looks at if we take the current rate and over a 5-year period, and that's actually part of C, really.
Right.
But we can talk about it now. So what we looked at was where would we have to go from our current rate? What kind of escalation would we have to see over a 5-year period to get to what that fair market value is now? That's not taking into account any inflation and increase over 5 years.
Over the 5 years.
So we're actually, being generous in that we're saying, well, let's consider this, and then would that be something that the FAA would be acceptable to? So it's easier on the tenant, and in the end accomplishes everything that they're requiring us to get to. Mr. Bond.
Thank you so much. 4 very quick things. With specificity, what exact FAA policies or regulations is the board relying upon that requires at the period of the renewal option that a appraisal has to be determined? So I'd like, if you can take some time to find out, like that before we leave.
Can I address that?
Please, thank you very much.
We can do that, but my understanding is the FAA doesn't require an appraisal at every renewal or every lease termination, but what the FAA expects is that at any given point in time during a lease relationship, the rent that is being paid is fair market value rent. And so the FAA expects that there will be escalation clauses or other mechanisms within the lease to accomplish that continuing compliance with the fair market value rent requirement over the term of the lease. So again, the point here is to ascertain through the appraisal that Mr. Albright performed whether this particular lease's mechanism for accomplishing that goal, 1.5% per year, has accomplished the goal.
I appreciate that. Is that your interpretation, or is there a specific regulation you're relying on in terms of the need to get an appraisal at this juncture? Is it in writing somewhere that we can see?
Well, I didn't say that there was a need to get an appraisal at this juncture. I believe it was a prudent exercise of the airport's various responsibilities to various parties that this was an appropriate time to try to ascertain whether that particular escalation mechanism, the 1.5% per year, had accomplished its goal, so that we're still looking at fair market value rent on the verge of the expiration of the initial term.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Does the airport apply the same standard for every lease that's renewed to get an appraisal at that time?
I haven't been involved in any situation other than this one, so I can't speak to that.
Okay. Is the airport okay with us obtaining our own independent appraisal to be compared with the, again, information that we have?
I don't have an issue with it.
Okay.
That's your decision. I think that it would be important that for direct comparisons, that your appraiser also complies with all the same FAA requirements in an appraisal.
Well, would the airport be okay holding off on any decision about this until we're able to obtain a second appraisal? So that can be compared in comparison with it.
And we're not making any decision today. Again, this is just a workshop to talk about all of the options that are there, and then move on from there with what we would take to a board eventually for a decision.
Well, are you okay? I'm not mentioning today. Will the airport agree to wait until we have the time? I know at a board meeting, you had mentioned it takes about six to 8 weeks to get an appraisal. So can we wait until we get another appraisal before we have any further discussions about this?
Or vote.
I would recommend to the board that the board be open to the firm obtaining its own appraisal.
Thank you.
As long as it can be conducted within a reasonable period of time. And if it is going to be useful, it's going to need to be an appraisal that's conducted in accordance with the FAA's expectations. And if the firm is going to pursue obtaining such an appraisal, if you would kindly let us know before we have to give our initial response to the FAA, that would be part of our response to justify that it might take a little time before we can get back to the FAA with a formal substantive proposal on how we intend to address the 3 non-compliance areas. And I would also suggest that during the time we're waiting for your appraisal, so we can consider it, we might be able to address the 2 aeronautical use issues as well.
1, that sounds fantastic. 2, I can confirm right now, I have approved authority right now to get a second appraisal.
Okay.
And 2, yes, I think that would be a fantastic idea.
All right. Would that
I'm sorry.
satisfy our response to the FAA at this time?
I think so, because as Mr. Taylor just mentioned, everything he said, we're acknowledging to the FAA, and that's what they asked for in their letter. They know that this isn't going to be resolved anyway in any quick manner, obviously. They know that in dealing with 129 other public use airports in Florida. So just back to the agenda real quick, because I want to hit these points, and then just so that we're all, informed about what some of the options are here.
Mr. Kirkland?
So, yes, ma'am.
I've been super, super patient and listening to all of this, but I would like to share, very related to what you all are discussing, that I hear what you're saying about the 1.5%. And I understand that. There are 2 sides to every perspective. I agree if I were in your shoes and I would look at the 1.5% over the term of 50 years, that's not going to keep up with inflation. So I understand that perspective. There's no disagreement from me, and that's never been the issue for us, for me. The other side of the equation is that this is a very remote location. And one of the reasons why the firm has significantly struggled to the tune of over $3 million in actual cash losses since we assumed the lease is it's very difficult to educate people why they should drive so far to come here and where is here. And we hear all the time, we don't know where you are. We've never heard of Keystone Heights. We've never heard of the firm. So on the one hand, what we're all in agreement on, because you want to row together, we can all row together on this. It's a tough situation because the firm has invested a ton of resources to try to get a name for itself in a very remote location. There aren't any hotels. Beds and heads is an issue. There's a lot of stuff that we, on our side, have to overcome to continue to function as a business. And at one point, we didn't know if we were necessarily going to exercise the continuation, because I was brought in 2017 to assess if this is even a viable business. So you guys feel you haven't been getting fair market rate because of this old lease. We're looking at the lease situation and running a business out here and struggling. And so there's pain points on both sides. And I would just like you all to be open to considering that, like we hear your pain points, but as part of the discussion that you also hear our pain points. And in our minds, in my mind, I should only speak for myself. I can't speak for everybody involved at the firm. In my mind, significant continued investments were made under the pretense that we were making them and could continue for another 25 years. So to have this come about this way is extremely difficult because if we had this discussion, which there's no way that anybody can say they didn't know a racetrack was being built sometime between 06 and 08, whenever the Google Earth maps that we have showed that it was being built. And there's no way that in the 2016 comp plan that we were non-compliant with our RPZ zone was not known, because there's minutes, there's meetings, it's a known thing.
Somebody didn't catch it.
And I really love what Rex shared and also what Mr. Ludwig shared. I'm sorry, what is your last name, sir? I should be consistent.
Seymour, that's fine.
Seymour. We would have been very open had whoever was making these decisions come to us and said, you're in pain, we're in pain, are there some creative solutions that are mutually beneficial? We would have loved that conversation.
And that's the conversation now that we're having,
That's
trying to
precisely
have.
what we're trying to do now.
Late in the day though, isn't it?
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's the right time.
It's a long while ago. This is all new for us. For us, maybe not for you guys, but for us sitting here, this is new for us. You have to understand that. And I'm the layman now. I'm not the clever one here. I'm the one that does all the work. But me standing back and looking at you guys, it's like, you're giving us this really late. And these people have to fix that. You have to fix my job. Just hear that.
Well, that's the reason that we're trying to go and talk about these options that are available and a way, as we're on this section, if we just went with the rent, which we know it's significantly higher. Probably FAA would say, check, okay, that's great. We're good with that. I don't know, can't speak for them. But knowing that reality, so what can we do? Because I'll say it again, we don't want you guys to go, all right? So how could we go about doing that? Mr. Taylor has alluded to some of it. If we looked at, and I think you have a Google Earth there, you should have something that looks like this, that shows the 285 acres, but then it shows it broken up into two parcels. Parcel A is where all of your racetrack is, where all of your buildings are, your garage, et cetera. That's probably the majority of where most of your training and activity occurs. So.
That's not true.
Well, okay, so, but there's an option.
That we can tell you,
Okay.
right? So that you have all the information.
Okay,
But
I know, but let's talk about if we reduced it just to your 135 acres.
what are the 135 acres?
Look on the diagram.
Yeah, so most of our military training and rally style training does not occur on the track. We use this section around it,
Okay, but that's parcel B,
so.
and I'm addressing that too for you. Because right now, that parcel approximately is 150 acres. You don't use all 150 acres. Brenda, tell all of us that you're utilizing that track, that off-road track. And the other graphic that I gave us was the Google Earth graphic that shows, it looks like about 67 acres. So what I want us to talk about.
Would you clarify, is this yellow identifying the 65 acres?
The 67, yeah, that's a
67.
Google Earth calculation.
Gotcha.
So what we're trying to do, for you guys is you're not using all of that wooded area around that track. So can we reduce those acres down that makes it more affordable for you? And then keep your parcel A where your headquarters is located, offices, et cetera, the other track. So that